My name is Emily Carson, and on the day I married the love of my life, I walked down the aisle alone, feeling every eye on me, and hearing the silent judgment of my own family ringing louder than church bells. But that moment, that lonely walk, wasn't the end of my story. It was the spark that set everything in motion. You see, while they mocked my husband for being just a plumber, America would soon see him as something very different. I grew up in a neat, picture-perfect suburban neighborhood outside Cincinnati, in a home where the driveway gleamed with polished cars and the yard was trimmed like a country club fairway. Sundays meant ironed clothes, polite smiles, and subtle competitions, newer appliances, bigger vacations, promotions to brag about during dinner. My parents weren't bad people. They were just deeply invested in how we looked to others. They believed status defined worth, and nothing terrified them more than slipping even 1 inch down the social ladder. When I first introduced Mark to them, I remember the exact moment their faces hardened. It was like watching fresh concrete set slow, but irreversible. My father looked at Mark's calloused hands, sunburnt forearms, and plain work boots, and asked in that forced light-hearted way that wasn't light-hearted at all, "So you fix toilets for a living?" Mark just smiled, easy and unbothered. "Yes, sir, among other things." I squeezed his hand underneath the table. My mother chimed in, pretending to joke. "Do you plan to stay in that line of work, or are you aiming for something better?" That was the first hint of the storm. I fell in love with Mark, not because of what he did, though I admire it, but because of who he was. He was kind, gentle, calm when life got chaotic. He worked long hours and came home tired, but he still took the time to ask me about my day. He remembered little things: my favorite tea, the song I hummed unconsciously while cooking, the way I liked the windows cracked slightly at night, even in winter. He also owned his own small plumbing business, something my parents never bothered to absorb. They couldn't see past the stereotype of manual labor. They heard plumber and pictured the lowest rung of some imaginary social ranking. My sister Claire didn't help. She was always competitive, always striving to be above others. She was dating an accountant at the time, not because she loved him, but because he drove a German car and had season tickets to the Bengals. She mocked Mark softly at first privately, then publicly. Once at a family barbecue, she said within earshot of everyone, "Emily's marrying a toolbox with legs." She thought it was hilarious. My parents laughed. I didn't. Still, I kept hoping they would warm up eventually. That love would soften them. That they would see Mark the way I did. He always remained respectful. He treated them kindly, answered their condescending questions with patience. But the deeper we went into wedding planning, the colder they became. I remember the moment things snapped. We were sitting in the living room in early spring, discussing seating arrangements and whether to invite my great-uncle Stephen, who had a habit of drinking too much champagne. My father suddenly put down his coffee cup and said bluntly, "Emily, you are making a mistake. You're marrying down. And one day you'll regret it." I stared at him, stunned. My mother didn't object. My sister smirked. Mark took a breath, then calmly said, "Sir, I may not have a fancy title, but I take care of your daughter. I love her. I treat her with respect. Isn't that what matters?" My father didn't look at him, not even for a second. He just shook his head. "It's not enough." That night, in the quiet of our apartment, I cried. Not because I doubted Mark, I never did, but because I finally realized something painful. My family valued image more than love. Mark held me as I cried, cradling my head against his chest. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered. The wedding approached. RSVPs came back, friends, coworkers, neighbors, old classmates, but not my parents, not my sister. Instead, I received a neatly worded email from my mother. "We cannot support this union. "We hope one day you'll come to your senses. We won't attend the wedding." No warmth, no hesitation. It was as if I had died. On the day of the wedding, I woke early, heart aching, but determined. The church was simple, but beautiful white pillars, stained glass, natural light spilling across the pews. My dress wasn't extravagant, but it made me feel radiant, strong, whole. When the music began and the doors opened, I saw a sea of faces, some smiling, some curious, none of them related to me by blood. No mother, no father, no sister. I felt the weight of emptiness, a hollowness only family can cause. But Mark was waiting at the altar, eyes soft, steady, full of love. In that moment, the loneliness lessened. I walked forward. And though the aisle stretched longer than any walkway I had ever taken, each step grew lighter, firmer. Because I wasn't walking toward abandonment. I was walking toward someone who had chosen me completely. The ceremony was tender and sincere. Our vows were real and vulnerable. Our guests later said the moment Mark's voice cracked slightly during his vow was the most touching part of the entire day. By the time we left the church as husband and wife, I felt like a chapter had closed and another had begun. I didn't know then that our wedding day, filmed quietly by a local TV station for a human interest segment, would soon spread across the country. I didn't know that millions of Americans would soon hear our story. And I certainly didn't know that within days my family would be calling me desperately. But at that moment, in the soft glow of early evening, I simply felt grateful. Grateful for Mark's hand in mine. Grateful for the friends who showed up. Grateful that I chose love over approval. Because love without apology is a powerful thing. I wish I could say that after the wedding, life settled into quiet happiness. But life rarely respects clean emotional endings, especially when old wounds haven't healed. In those first few weeks of marriage, Mark and I found ourselves in that warm, gentle glow. Newlyweds know well breakfasts at our small kitchen table, him whistling while packing up his toolbox for the day, me learning to rearrange life around a shared we. But behind all of that was a shadow, the silence of my family. I didn't reach out to them, I couldn't. Every time I imagined speaking to them, I heard their voices again, marrying down, embarrassing, not good enough. That kind of dismissal doesn't just sting, it embeds itself deep. Mark never pressured me to reconnect with them. He simply let me talk when I needed to. One evening, about a week after the wedding, I found myself slumped on the couch, staring into nothing. He sat beside me, still smelling faintly of copper glue and old pipes. "You miss them," he said softly. I didn't lift my head. I miss the version of them I used to think existed. He slid his hand into mine. No speeches, no attempts at counseling, just presence. Meanwhile, life kept moving in its ordinary, grounded ways. Mark had his daily calls, leaky sinks, broken water heaters, clogged sewer lines. I watched him leave every morning in his battered white work van with a quiet pride. Because Americans over 60, they know something today's world sometimes forgets. There is dignity in honest labor, the kind that gets your hands dirty, the kind that actually keeps society working. One afternoon, I tagged along with Mark on a major job fixing an old woman's corroded basement piping. Mrs. Baker, 78, widowed, still sharp-minded, welcomed us with iced tea and a stern reminder to keep the basement door shut so her cat wouldn't escape. I sat upstairs with her while Mark worked. So she asked, while adjusting her glasses, "I heard you two just got married." "Yes, ma'am." "Good man, that one," she said, nodding toward the basement. "My late husband worked construction. Folks looked down on him sometimes. But that man built half the roads in this county. He worked every day of his life. That's worth something." I felt something unclench in me. Worth something. When Mark finished hours later, dusty and sweaty, Mrs. Baker insisted on paying more than his invoice. When he protested, she waved her hand. A good man deserves to be compensated properly. We helped her back upstairs, and she gave me a small smile. You chose well, dear. I absorbed her words like warm sunlight. Still outside moments like that, I found myself glimpsing other people's judgments, strangers, co-workers, acquaintances. So what does your husband do? Oh, plumbing. Well, that's nice. Is he planning to go into management someday? At least he'll always have work, I guess. The tone was always the same, polite but patronizing, and every slight accumulated layering over my heart like sediment. Mark felt it too, not in words, but in society's subtle ways. A banker once refused to make eye contact with him while discussing paperwork. A restaurant hostess instinctively handed me the check instead of him. A neighbor joked, "Hey Mark, I've got a toilet that's just full of personality. Want to take a look?" Mark shrugged those things off, but I noticed. Work for me during this time was quieter. I ran a small bookkeeping business from home. My clients were mostly retirees and small local shops. I liked the rhythm of it. Numbers behaved when people didn't. One day, while I was updating quarterly spreadsheets, the TV softly murmured in the background, the evening human interest segment I rarely paid attention to. But then I heard, next, a touching story about a bride who walked down the aisle alone. And the man she chose. My heart stilled. I looked up. There we were. The soft camera pans of our wedding, the gentle narration describing a bride whose family refused to attend because the groom was a plumber. The reporter spoke with reverence, not sensationalism. But despite judgment and abandonment, Emily and Mark said their vows in front of a community of friends, co-workers, and neighbors, proving that love, humility, and dignity mean far more than social status. I felt my throat tighten, tears pooling slow heavy. Mark walked in halfway through the segment, just back from work. He stopped frozen, watching himself on the screen. He blinked, slowly, surprised. Then the applause. It wasn't in our living room, it was on TV. The studio audience, the anchor, the online comments scrolling beneath the broadcast. Beautiful story. Real love still exists. This is what marriage is about. I'd be proud to have that man as a son-in-law. That family should be ashamed. Nothing wrong with being a plumber, salt of the earth. Mark sank slowly onto the couch beside me, almost in disbelief. I leaned my head on his shoulder. The TV continued its montage of images, our vows, Mark smiling shyly, the friends, cheering confetti, fluttering like blessings. When the segment ended, Mark exhaled a long, amazed breath. Well, didn't expect that. I laughed through tears, you and me both. We sat there deeply still and deeply connected, as if the world had finally spoken the truth out loud. But the real shock didn't happen until the next morning. Mark woke to the sound of my cell phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. Missed calls, voicemails, messages, dozens. I blinked awake and stared at the screen. 3:41 a.m., Mom. 3:55 a.m., Mom. 4:22 a.m., Dad. 5:07 a.m., Mom. 5:15 a.m., Claire. 5:17 a.m., Claire. 5:20 a.m., Dad. 5:21 a.m., Claire. 6 a.m., Mom. 100 missed calls. 100. Mark looked over my shoulder. They saw it. I nodded slowly. Yeah. But I didn't return the calls. Not yet. Because something had shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one seeking their approval. They were the ones seeking mine. And that realization, after a lifetime of feeling lesser, was powerful. Part 2, 1030 words. Pan dyan no'y continue ChatGPT dyan no'y. Part 3, 1040 words. The morning after the broadcast, the air in our house felt different. Not tense exactly, more like charged, as if a storm had already passed, but the thunder still echoed in the distance. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, hands wrapped around it like an anchor. Mark was making eggs humming, acting like the world hadn't just turned upside down. But his eyes kept flicking toward my phone on the table. It buzzed again. My mother. Again. I finally picked it up. Voicemail. This one only 16 seconds long. Emily, please call us back. This has gone too far. We need to speak. I played another one. Dad. Voice stiff. We deserve a conversation. You've embarrassed us on national television. That wasn't fair. Not fair. I almost choked on spite. Not fair. Walking alone down the aisle wasn't fair. Having your fiancé mocked for his work wasn't fair. Hearing your family laugh at the man you love wasn't fair. I didn't say any of that, not yet. Mark set down 2 plates and joined me. We don't have to call them today. Or at all. You get to decide the timing. I nodded. But I did want to hear what they had to say, even if I wasn't ready to reply. That afternoon I returned a call, but not to my parents. To Claire. She answered halfway through the first ring. Oh, thank God. Emily, listen, we need to talk. Her voice was shaky, not her usual smug confidence. More like someone who'd just been publicly dragged and wasn't used to being the target. You saw the segment, I said calmly. Yes. Look, it was edited in the worst possible way. They made us look like villains. Those comments, hundreds of strangers calling us snobs, shallow, hateful. You called Mark a toolbox with legs at a family gathering. Silence. Then that was a joke. No, I said softly, it wasn't. I could almost feel her bristle through the phone. You think that just because he works with pipes and toilets, he's... I didn't finish. Because she already knew. Claire exhaled. Emily can't, we just get together and talk. Soon, I said, but not today. And I hung up gently but decisively. The following week unfolded in a surreal blend of normal and extraordinary. Mark kept working his usual calls, though. Now customers recognized him. At one house, an older gentleman shook his hand firmly and said, Son, I saw you on the news. You're a good man. Don't let anyone shame you for what you do. Mark came home that night with quiet tears in his eyes. I've never felt respected like that. Not by strangers. As for me, I visited the grocery store and was stopped 3 separate times by women in their 60s and 70s, the church lady age group, as Mark jokingly called them. One woman squeezed my hand and said, Honey, I married a carpenter. My mama thought I was marrying beneath me. But that man treated me like gold for 42 years. Don't you regret a thing. Another added, Parents can be wrong. It's okay to admit it later. Just don't close the door on them forever. We all learn differently. Their words lodged in my mind. Not accusations, not pity, just perspective. Finally, after days of thinking, I called my parents. My mother answered breathless, as if she'd been waiting with the phone in her hand. Emily. I kept my voice neutral. We can meet. At our house. Saturday. I could almost hear the surprise. At your house? Yes. If you want to talk, you'll come here. No fancy staging. No power. No neutral territory. They would enter my home. My mother swallowed audibly. We'll be there. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, which fit my mood. Mark cleaned the living room twice, though it didn't need it. I baked banana bread, even though I wasn't sure anyone would eat. At precisely 3 o'clock, my parents' car pulled up outside. I watched through the window. They sat there for almost a full minute before getting out. When I opened the door, there was a strange awkwardness, like greeting distant relatives instead of flesh and blood family. My father looked older. My mother's eyes looked tired. And both of them had the heavy posture of people arriving for an apology they weren't used to giving. Inside there was a silence before my mother finally spoke. We saw the broadcast. I waited. We didn't realize she began. But my father interrupted. It was biased. It painted us as heartless. That show twisted the narrative. It made us look. Mark set 2 coffees down gently, interrupting without confrontation. It didn't make you look any way, he said quietly. Your own words did. My father stiffened. But he didn't argue. My mother took a breath. We made a mistake. We judged you, Mark. And we judged the value of your work. That wasn't right. Then she turned to me. And Emily, we hurt you. We abandoned you. That haunts me. Her voice cracked. I realized something, then even parents, for all their confidence, are just flawed humans wrestling with their blind spots. My father finally looked Mark fully in the eye. My father was a machinist, he said unexpectedly. Blue collar. Worked 60-hour weeks. He used to come home drenched in sweat. I resented that life. I swore I would be different. And I think I overcorrected. I equated white collar with worth. Mark nodded slowly. But you know better now. My father swallowed. I'm trying. Those 2 words, simple, humble, landed deeply. We ended the meeting without dramatic breakthrough or grand forgiveness, but with something quieter. A beginning. When they left, Mark and I collapsed on the couch, exhausted. Well, he said that could have gone worse. I laughed. It could have gone better, too. But it's a start. That night, as I washed dishes, Mark stood behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. You know, he said softly, our story isn't just ours anymore. What do you mean? People related to it. They saw themselves in it. The plumber, the bride, the estranged family, the learning, the humility. It touched something old-fashioned, something true. I thought of the people in the grocery store, the older couples, the nods of solidarity. He was right. Our story carried something bigger than personal hurt. It was about dignity, work, love, pride, humility, and the slow, painful grace of forgiveness. In the weeks that followed that first uneasy reconciliation, life carried a new rhythm, not rushed, not dramatic, but steady. Like the slow turning of soil before a harvest. Something had shifted. My parents weren't suddenly transformed angels of humility, but they had begun inching toward it. Their calls became gentler, their questions less judgmental, and the sharp edges that once cut so deep slowly dulled. But while that slow healing happened in private, something else was building outside our home public interest. The wedding segment didn't vanish after a single broadcast. It was reposted, reshared, discussed online. People, especially older Americans, connected with it. Veterans wrote in support of Mark's work ethic. Grandmothers praised the sweetness of our vows. Long-married couples reminisced about starting life with nothing but love. Our story traveled. One afternoon, I received an email from a producer at a national morning show. They wanted a short follow-up interview, not flashy, just sincere. I mentioned it to Mark, expecting hesitation. Instead, he chuckled. You think anyone wants to hear me talk about sump pumps and water heaters on television? I nudged him gently. They want to hear about life, about love, about getting your hands dirty and still coming home proud. He blushed slightly, a quiet man unaccustomed to attention. All right, he said, if you'll be beside me. The interview happened remotely via video call. No studio lights or makeup. Just us sitting on our couch laptop, angled just right, Mark wearing his clean but faded work shirt. The host, a warm-voiced woman in her 60s named Linda, smiled on screen. Mark, a lot of viewers were moved by your quiet confidence. They loved that you never apologized for your profession. Tell us, did the criticism ever shake you? Mark shifted, thoughtful. It hurt, knowing Emily was hurt. But I never felt ashamed of plumbing. I help people. I solve real problems. And I like being useful. That line landed perfectly. Linda then turned to me. And Emily, could you tell us what you saw in Mark that others overlooked? I took a breath. I saw a man who works with honor, who loves without ego, who treats every person with respect. And I saw someone who doesn't measure worth by titles, only by character. Linda nodded slowly, eyes soft. Well, folks, there you have it. When the call ended, I looked at Mark, cheeks pink, hands fidgeting. You did beautifully, I said. He shook his head. I just spoke the truth. And that truth found its way deeper and wider into people's hearts. Soon after, something unexpected began happening. Mark's business, once modest and steady, exploded in demand. Calls poured in from homeowners who specifically wanted the good-hearted plumber from TV. Elderly clients trusted him instantly. Single mothers said they felt safe with him. Veterans swapped service stories with him. Mark didn't raise prices. He didn't turn into a salesman. He just kept doing honest work. But there was something new in his voice at night. Something proud. Something fulfilled. This feels good, he admitted one evening as we sat on the porch drinking sweet tea as twilight settled. Being appreciated. Not for show, but for effort. I rested my head on his shoulder. You earned it. Meanwhile, my family's public shame became a private reckoning. Claire had gone quiet for a while. Then one day, she called. Emily, can we meet just the two of us? I agreed. We chose a small diner, the kind with vinyl booths and coffee that never runs out. When I walked in, Claire already looked different. Less polished, less ornamental, more human. She stirred her coffee slowly. I was cruel, she said outright. And worse, I was blind. I waited. She continued, voice thin. Growing up, I thought status meant security. Titles meant success. I thought marrying up was the goal. She swallowed hard. But watching Mark, and then seeing people respond, I realized I've spent years measuring worth with the wrong ruler. Her eyes lifted and found mine. I was jealous, Emily. Jealous that you chose love boldly. Jealous that Mark loves you so completely. Jealous that you weren't afraid of being ordinary. Ordinary. I smiled gently. There's nothing ordinary about real love. For the first time in years, Claire's face softened genuinely. I want to do better, she said. That's all I ask, I replied. Around this time, my parents invited us for dinner, a gesture I hadn't expected. Mark and I drove to their house, the tidy suburban home where I grew up. I braced myself for awkwardness. But when my father greeted Mark handshake firm, he added something I never thought I'd hear. Mark, would you show me sometime how you solder copper pipe? I've always wanted to learn. And Mark, kind as ever, lit up with delight. Of course, anytime. The evening unfolded gently. We talked about real things, work, aging neighbors' memories, not status, not shame. At one point, my mother leaned toward me and whispered, You seem happier and strong. I exhaled softly. I am. She nodded. A surrender and an acknowledgement. One evening, much later, Mark and I were sitting by the radio, listening to an oldies station, Golden Voices from the 60s and 70s, floating through the living room. That's when a phone notification pinged. It was a message from a viewer, a man in his 70s. It read, Thank you. I spent my life fixing engines. My daughter once cried because she wished I had a better job. Watching your story helped her understand. We talked for the first time in years. I just wanted you to know. I read it aloud. Mark went quiet, deeply quiet, before wiping a tear. I took his hand. You see, I whispered, you're changing more than pipes. He laughed softly at that. And in the warm hush of evening, with music drifting through our home, and peace settling around us like a gentle quilt, I finally understood something. The power of one story, one moment, one choice to stand by the person you love. It doesn't just heal your own life, it helps heal others. And that's a kind of justice no revenge could ever match. As the months passed, the shock of our public story slowly settled into something steadier, a kind of quiet respect that surrounded Mark, and by extension, our marriage. The calls from strangers turned into heartfelt letters. The recognition in public turned from curiosity into warmth. And somewhere in that shifting tide of sentiment, I found myself changing too. Before all this, I had always been someone who avoided attention, someone who spoke softly, didn't brag, and felt safest blending in. But now, something inside me stood taller, straighter, kinder, stronger. I found myself speaking up when people made assumptions about blue-collar work. I corrected them not with edge or anger, but with assurance. One afternoon, I was at a friend's backyard barbecue, mostly people I'd known since high school. One of them, a woman named Tiffany, leaned toward me conspiratorially. "So, be honest. Now that Mark's business is booming, do you ever think about helping him expand? Maybe turning it into something bigger? I mean, surely he doesn't want to be doing physical plumbing work forever." I didn't even hesitate. Tiffany, Mark loves the work. He isn't trying to escape it. He finds purpose in solving real problems. She blinked. "But wouldn't it be better if he became a manager instead? More respectable?" I smiled gently, not patronizing, just patient. The respect comes from the work itself, not the title. An older man nearby grilling sausages overheard and chuckled. Amen to that. Spent 40 years driving trucks. Best years of my life. And just like that micro-conversation by micro-conversation, I noticed that older Americans understood this instinctively. They felt the dignity of labor. My generation, not always, but maybe they could learn. As for my family, the healing continued step by slow step. One day, my father stopped by unannounced. Mark was fixing a leak in the kitchen sink and didn't see him arrive. When I opened the door, my father held a small box. Inside was a set of soldering tools neatly cleaned and oiled. "I got these from a retired plumber," he said awkwardly. "He told me they're good ones. I thought maybe I could learn." My eyes stung. "You want to learn plumbing?" He exhaled. "I want to understand the work I once dismissed so easily." Mark came out from the kitchen at that moment, wiping his hands. My father almost looked nervous. "If you have time, maybe you could show me." And Mark, bless him, smiled in that gentle, accepting way. "Of course." They went out to the garage. I watched through the window as Mark explained how copper fittings worked, how heat flowed along the material, how timing mattered. My father listened, truly listened, asking questions, nodding carefully. At one point he laughed after making a sloppy joint that dripped. Mark clapped his shoulder. "Everyone's first one looks like that. Try again." And my father did. Meanwhile, Claire experienced her own transformation. She'd always been ambitious in ways that sometimes bordered on ruthless. But something changed after reflecting on our story. She ended things with the accountant boyfriend, politely, decisively. She started volunteering on weekends at a community center. She spent more time with ordinary folks and joked half seriously. "I'm in humility training." One evening, she came over for dinner. Halfway through the meal, she turned to Mark. "Can I ask you something personal?" Mark shrugged. "Sure. What do you like about plumbing, I mean, day to day?" Mark thought for a moment. "Well, I like the trust. People let me into their homes, into private spaces, and I like that when I leave things work better than when I arrived. There's satisfaction in that." Claire nodded, slowly absorbing it. Then she said something I never expected. "I used to look for admiration, but I think maybe I should have been looking for meaning." Mark smiled. "The meaning can be anywhere. You just have to show up for it." Around this time, the local high school invited Mark to give a talk to students exploring vocational careers. He was nervous at first, public speaking wasn't his comfort zone, but he agreed. They set him up in the auditorium with 40 teenagers and a handful of teachers. Some kids slouched skeptical. Some looked bored. But a few, especially those whose families worked trades, gazed at him attentively. Mark started awkwardly clearing his throat. "I'm not here to sell you anything," he said. "Not a career or a life path. I just want to say, there are many ways to be a valuable person." He held up his hands. "These hands have gotten dirty every day for 15 years, but they've earned respect the honest way." A boy in the front row raised his hand. "My dad's a roofer. He comes home sore every night. But I know he's proud. Is it like that for you?" Mark nodded. "Yes, exactly like that." Another boy asked, "Do you make good money?" Mark chuckled. "Enough to support my family. Enough to give my wife a safe home. Enough to stand tall. That's what matters." Afterward, a teacher approached me privately. "That was powerful," she said. "We need more voices like his. The kids hear so much pressure to chase office jobs like that's the only respectable future." I nodded. Respect is earned by effort, not environment. But perhaps one of the most touching moments came later, a letter we received from a couple in their 70s. It read, "We married young. He was a mechanic, I was a waitress. Our families thought we were foolish. But we built a life, brick by brick, together. Seeing your story reminded us of our own beginnings. Thank you for bringing back the memory of our young love, simple and strong." I cried while reading that one aloud. Not because it was sad, but because it was real. Evenings in our home became moments of reflection. Mark and I would sit together sometimes, with tea, sometimes with silence, and think about how far we'd come since the lonely walk down the aisle. One night, as lightning bugs flickered on the lawn, Mark said, "Do you ever think about how one moment can change everything? Just one." I leaned into him. "Yes, the moment I chose you." He kissed the top of my head. "And the moment you kept choosing me even when others didn't." By now, the sting of abandonment was fading. The anger had cooled, and something else had taken its place. Gratitude. Gratitude for the struggle because it revealed truth. Gratitude for the pain because it strengthened love. Gratitude for the public attention because it helped others heal too. This story was no longer just about a wedding. It was about dignity, work, family, growth, humility, and the resilience of choosing love again and again. As the year approached its close, the changes in our family began to feel less like isolated gestures and more like a genuinely new way of relating to one another. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't instant. It was slow, like thaw after a long winter. The brittle frost of pride melted into something softer, humility, curiosity, and a shared willingness to begin again. For Thanksgiving, my parents extended an invitation fully aware of the significance. The last time I'd walked into their house before the wedding, I had been a daughter they were quietly disappointed in. This time, I arrived as someone they now respected. And more importantly, a person they were trying to understand. Mark and I pulled up to the curb, and before we even reached the door, it swung open. My mother greeted us with a warmth that caught me off guard, arms around me, holding me longer than she used to. My father patted Mark on the back, not perfunctory, but sincere. Inside the table was set simply no ostentatious centerpieces or competitive display, just food and family. Claire was there too, glowing in a way I'd never seen, less brittle, less hard, more human. Halfway through the meal, my father raised his glass. "To Emily and Mark, for showing us that love is something worth learning about." Mark cleared his throat and stood awkward but earnest. "And to Emily's parents for being willing to learn with us." There was a ripple of soft laughter, and the moment passed, but it stayed with me. After dinner, while Mark and my father returned to the garage tinkering with copper pipes and laughing over failed connections, my mother led me into the living room, just the two of us. She sat down on the couch with a slow sigh. "Emily," she began, her voice low, "I want you to know something." I waited. I didn't grow up with a father who praised hard work. He wanted me to marry up, to never worry about money or reputation. I absorbed that. I carried it like a compass, always pointing toward status. Her eyes shimmered as she continued. But I never realized that compass wasn't guiding me toward goodness, just toward approval. She reached for my hand. "And I judged your choices through that broken lens. But I don't want to anymore." I squeezed her fingers gently. "You're trying. That matters." She nodded, and that small nod felt like a generation of inherited pride, loosening its grip. Meanwhile, in the garage, Mark and my father had developed their own evolving bond. I would peek in and see Mark teaching him practical techniques, wiping the joint before heating, watching the metal's color, sensing the shift from solid to molten. My father approached it like a student, not a man defending ego. One evening, as we prepared to leave, my father pressed something into Mark's hand, a simple leather wallet. "It belonged to my father," he said. "He kept old union cards and receipts from the factory in there. I want you to have it." Mark looked astonished. "Are you sure?" "Yes," my father replied. "You've reminded me of him in all the best ways." When Mark opened the wallet later at home, there was a faded photo tucked inside a man in work overalls, smiling broadly, grease on his cheek. It felt like passed down permission, a quiet blessing across time. Claire's transformation deepened, too. One day she came over to help make dinner, rolling up her sleeves and joining in as Mark and I prepared a simple stew. "You know," she said while chopping carrots, "I've been thinking about building something meaningful of my own." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well, I've always wanted to work with people, not above them, not in competition with them. I'm thinking of going into social work or community outreach, something that matters." I blinked in surprise, then smiled. "That sounds right for you." She chuckled. Took me long enough to realize. Around Christmas, the local community center reached out, asking if Mark would volunteer teaching basic home plumbing maintenance to homeowners, especially seniors. He agreed enthusiastically. He spent weekends showing retirees how to unclog drains, tighten fittings, and understand their own homes. One woman aged 73 laughed as she wiped her hands on a rag. "I never thought I'd be learning this at my age. But I feel empowered." Mark beamed. "That's the idea." I watched from the sidelines, admiring him all over again. Not because of the public validation, the TV attention, the praise from strangers, but because of who he was in quiet rooms, patient, generous, humble. And then one evening, a moment of deep reflection arrived. We were sitting on the back porch, bundled in blankets, watching the December stars. Mark's breath formed small clouds in the air as he spoke. "You know, when your family turned away from us, I thought I could handle it. But there were nights when I wondered if maybe I wasn't good enough. Not for you, but for them." My heart constricted. "You were always good enough. They just didn't see it yet." He nodded. "But now they're trying. And that means something." I rested my head against his shoulder. "Yes, it means love can teach, slowly but surely." Then came perhaps the most surprising development. My mother started attending Mark's community classes, not to learn plumbing really, but to witness the interaction. To hear people tell Mark thank you. To observe trust and gratitude exchanged. Once as we left, she remarked softly, "He's doing ministry work, he just doesn't call it that." I smiled. Service is service. Whether it's fixing water lines or feeding souls. She breathed in deeply. I see that now. The real turning point, the emotional crown of the year, came near New Year's Eve. My family and Mark and I sat around our dining table in our home, our space, and for the first time, it felt like everyone was here, not under obligation, but under belonging. My father spoke gently. "Emily, Mark, thank you for not shutting the door on us. Thank you for letting us learn. And thank you for loving each other in ways that taught us about our own failures." Mark shook his head. "This wasn't about punishment. It was about growth," Claire added. "We all needed to grow. Not just you two. All of us." I looked around at these people I had once almost lost and felt something warm flood my chest. Not triumph, not revenge, not vindication, but healing. As winter thawed into spring, it felt like we were stepping into a gentler chapter of life. The bitterness of the past had faded into something far less sharp. My family, once divided by pride and perception, now found themselves knitted back together by humility and learning. And Mark, dear Mark, no longer walked with the apologetic posture of a man underestimated, but with the quiet dignity of someone finally recognized for who he was. One Sunday morning, we invited my parents and Claire over for brunch. It was nothing fancy: scrambled eggs, pancakes, bacon, but laughter filled the kitchen with a warmth that had no price tag. My father carried in a bouquet of simple garden flowers, not roses or orchids, just fresh-cut daisies and lilacs. "For the house," he said, handing them to me. "For the heart," Mark added, smiling. There was a lightness that hadn't been there before, a sense that the air had cleared. Even Claire brought something, a small framed photograph. It was from our wedding day, Mark and I standing outside the church, looking at each other instead of the camera. "I had this printed," she said shyly. "I thought, maybe you'd want it displayed somewhere." I ran a hand over the smooth frame, absorbing the moment. "It's perfect," I said. And I meant it. Weeks later, my father invited Mark and me to attend a local trade appreciation dinner hosted by a coalition of blue-collar unions and small businesses. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't televised. But it was real. We entered a VFW hall decorated with banners from decades of labor history, manufacturing pasts, and present livelihoods. Men in work boots and denim jackets exchanged stories with women who'd spent years working hospital floors, factory lines, and school cafeterias. There was pride in the room, but not arrogance. Pride born from survival and contribution. At one point, a retired electrician approached Mark. "You're the one from that wedding story, right?" Mark nodded modestly. "Good man," the electrician said, gripping his hand tight. It was about damn time someone reminded folks that building things and fixing things matter. My father listened nearby, absorbing every word. Later that night, he pulled me aside. "You know," he said, "I spent so long trying to climb a ladder that I didn't realize I was looking down on people who were actually holding it steady." I looked at him with compassion. "You've changed." He chuckled softly. "Thank God." But perhaps the simplest and most meaningful moment happened quietly, almost insignificantly, on a random Tuesday afternoon. I was folding laundry while Mark was out on a job. My mother called and said she wanted to stop by. When she arrived, she didn't bring news or a request or an agenda. She simply asked if she could help me fold the sheets. We stood side by side, smoothing corners and aligning edges, and after a while she said, "I want to tell you something." I paused, listening. "You didn't choose wrong. You chose deeply. And I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the life you're building. And I'm humbled by the lesson I had to learn." I swallowed a lump in my throat. "You didn't have to tell me that," I whispered. "I did," she replied. "Because love should be spoken when it's learned." Spring melted fully into summer, and our house became a revolving door of family visits, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire to be together. My father helped Mark install a new water heater in the basement. Claire brought over puzzles and board games. My mother baked bread that filled every room with yeasty warmth. One evening after everyone left, Mark closed the front door behind them and leaned against it, crossing his arms with a thoughtful smile. What I asked? You know, he said slowly, I used to think I would always be the plumber your family looked down on. I thought that identity was permanent. But now, he glanced toward the door, soft light filtering in. Now I'm just Mark, son-in-law, husband, friend. I walked up to him and wrapped my arms around his middle. You were always those things, I said. They just needed time to see it. At some point, people stopped recognizing us from the wedding story. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm. And honestly, I welcomed it. Instead of being the couple on TV, we became something better, the couple next door. The couple walking their dog. The couple planting tomatoes in the garden. The couple laughing at inside jokes in the cereal aisle. But every now and then, someone older, a silver-haired widow, or a retired veteran would stop Mark and say, "Thank you. You reminded people that character matters." And that mattered to us. Then came our first anniversary. We hosted a small gathering in our backyard. Fairy lights, strung between trees, simple mason jars on tables, a gentle June breeze brushing the grass. My father stood to make a toast. Today, he began, we aren't celebrating a wedding. We're celebrating a transformation. Not just theirs, ours. Because this marriage didn't just join two people, it taught four of us how to be better. My mother wiped her eyes. Claire wrapped her arm around mine. And Mark, beautiful, humble, steady Mark, squeezed my hand under the table. When the toast ended, Mark stood and spoke softly, not to grandstand, but to reflect. I don't care if I spend the rest of my life fixing pipes. If the world ends, and all I've done is help people love my wife and live honestly, it's enough. The backyard was silent for a long, reverent moment. Then applause, warm-rooted, heartfelt. In the quiet of that night, after the guests left, after the lights were turned off, after the dishes were rinsed, Mark and I sat together on the porch barefoot in the dark, listening to crickets. He whispered, "Do you ever think about what our story really means?" I nodded. "It means you don't need permission from the world to value yourself." He smiled. "And it means sometimes the people who hurt you most can grow too." We sat there in silence, the kind of silence filled with meaning rather than absence. And so if you've stayed with me through this story, I want to ask you something gently, from the heart. If someone in your life is working hard, truly working, don't judge the hands that get dirty. Judge the heart that stays clean. If someone you love has made mistakes, leave them room to learn. Leave them space to come back. Leave them grace. And if you've ever felt unseen for who you are, know this: you matter. Your work matters. Your love matters. Your life matters. Thank you for listening. If our story touched you, I invite you to reflect, share your own story, or stay with us for the next one.